On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Less than a month after the 9/11 attacks, a shell-shocked America was already at war. The invasion was swift, as was the downfall of Afghanistan's Taliban government. It fell only 5 weeks after the US launched its first attacks on Afghan soil on October the 7th, 2001. Terror was the target.
An eye for an eye makes the world right.
Opponents of this new war were drowned out by the rallying cry for unity.
Our war against terror is only beginning.
To some critics, terror was a problematic enemy and an omen for a war that would never end. Not one of the hijackers in the 9/11 attacks was from Afghanistan, but it was a time in America ripe for retribution against Al-Qaeda, along with the Taliban government that was sheltering the group. Al-Qaeda went on the run, and its leader, Osama bin Laden, hid out in Afghanistan's southeastern mountains. But terror wasn't vanquished, and a messy conflict would ensue that 15 years later hasn't ended, nor the threat of Al-Qaeda or a resurgent Taliban. Every empire that has tried to capture Afghanistan has failed. The Soviet Union fell 2 years after it withdrew in 1989, ending a 9-year armed conflict with the Afghan Mujahideen, who would go from being America's allies to America's enemies. The US has also endured a costly conflict in Afghanistan, and one also widely seen as futile. It has cost the US 2,400 American lives, along with $850 billion. And while civil infrastructure has been built up, along with Afghan security forces, 15 years later, the future of the country is in peril. Some critics say the US pivot towards Iraq gave the Taliban, which had taken refuge across Afghanistan's hinterland border with Pakistan, an opportunity to regroup. But former US Ambassador to Afghanistan Ryan Crocker has said the ultimate point of failure for our efforts wasn't an insurgency. It was the weight of endemic corruption. Now Afghan security is in Afghan hands. The US has drawn down its forces in Afghanistan that at its height was around 100,000 troops to around 10,000 today, who are there in an advisory capacity. The Taliban currently wields a heavy influence and by some estimates controls 30% of the country. A bleak scenario for Afghanistan that these days largely goes unnoticed in the US, a nation now embroiled in a war on terror that has spread to multiple fronts across the world. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me here in the studio is Mark Kimmett, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. And from Toronto, I'm joined by author and foreign correspondent Eric Margolis. Thanks both so much for joining us. Let's just start from the beginning. Was launching the invasion of Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, as it was called 15 years ago, the best strategic decision post-September 11th? Let me start in the studio with Mark.
I think it was. I don't think we had any other choice at that point. Again, looking back 15 years, from the perspective of 15 years, there may have been other options. But at that time, we had the largest attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor. And the people that died in those attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. Deserved vindication, and they also deserved to know that we were going to strike against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates wherever and whenever they operated.
Okay, Eric, hindsight is 2020, but 2 weeks after September 11th, and these discussions started, was this the right thing to do, this strategic decision to make to go into Afghanistan?
No, I think history has proven that it was a terrible mistake. It was done because President Bush had been caught sleeping on guard duty by the attack. Americans were outraged, and they were demanding some kind of revenge. And it was couldn't find anybody because most of the perpetrators came from Saudi Arabia. Nobody in the Bush administration was joined at the hip with the Saudis. So Afghanistan was picked as a target for American rage, and a very powerful campaign was mounted to portray it as a nest of terrorists. I was there at the time, and these so-called terrorist training camps were in fact camps where mujahideen were being trained by Pakistani intelligence to go and fight the Indians in Kashmir, not terrorists. And I would say after all these years that I still have not seen the conclusive proof that Osama bin Laden was engineered or was behind this attack.
Okay, I mean, some would call that quite a conspiracy theory, if I can use that term. But I mean, Eric, what was the U.S. supposed to do? Allow the Taliban to perpetuate its rule, for Al-Qaeda to fester after that kind of attack on the United States? Some have even argued that taking the Taliban out was a good thing regardless of the events of September 11th.
Well, events have proven what a wrong argument this was. Taliban had nothing to do with 9/11. That attack was planned in Hamburg, Germany, and in Spain. It's not in Afghanistan. So the Americans were venting their rage rather than having a thoughtful policy.
Mark, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think he has the facts wrong. We had been watching Osama bin Laden for years and years. He was kicked out of Saudi Arabia, set up in Khartoum. He was kicked out of Sudan and went to Afghanistan, where he set up his training camps. As you know and remember, President Clinton himself ordered strikes on Tarmiya farms in southern Afghanistan. They weren't carried out for the simple reason that there were other belligerents, non-belligerents in that location at that time. The fact remains is that the Taliban are not Al-Qaeda, so stipulated, but they were harboring and they were supporting the Al-Qaeda organization, and they were allowing that area that they controlled to be used as training camps to plan, train, and launch attacks from, not simply in Hamburg, not simply in places such as that. Core Al-Qaeda was working out of Afghanistan, and that's an indisputable fact.
Okay. I'd like to move it forward a little bit because, Mark, as you know, many analysts have said that actually the job in Afghanistan could have been finished. Afghanistan could have been pacified, if we can put it that way, if the United States had not gotten bogged down in the invasion of Iraq. What do you make of those places?
Two things. I think the United States is capable of more than one operation at a time. In fact, the U.S. plans for the military are to conduct two major regional conflicts against perhaps North Korea and a Middle East antagonist at any one time. To suggest that we didn't have the capability to fight both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, especially with the coalition partners that we had, again, justifies logic and fact.
Eric, your comments?
Well, the main error that the United States made was not invading Iraq. That was itself was a separate disaster. But it is true that the U.S. had sufficient forces to wage two small wars. The mistake that the U.S. made was that when it went into Afghanistan, it used the old Roman divide and rule plan, and it allied itself with the most unacceptable, sleazy elements in Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance drug dealers, the communists cadres, the Northern Uzbeks, who were allies of the communists, the Communist Intelligence Service. These were all people who were involved in war crimes and in drug trades. And the situation remains today that we have a bunch of dishonest, very deeply corrupt people. If there's a U.S. report that just came out, U.S. government report, saying that the country is being engulfed by corruption and all good that the U.S. has been trying to do is being negated by the deep corruption. We've got to stop dealing with these corrupt Afghans. The Afghan army has no loyalty to the government. Why should it? They're a bunch of crooks.
Eric, sorry, Mark, you do at least agree on that point, that the corruption is...
Well, I really do, but the first point I would make is this notion that we lied ourselves with the wrong people. Look, We fought side by side with the Soviet Union to destroy Hitler's Germany in World War II, and then fought a Cold War against them for the next 50 years. So we can't necessarily pick our enemies, but we can pick our allies to destroy our enemies. Second point, in this fact, I do agree with Eric. It's important to understand that when we think of nation building, whether you like to do it or not, it takes three elements: defense, development, and diplomacy. I think the military has done its job well, but in terms of diplomacy and development and the endemic corruption that followed from that, I believe, like Eric, that really has been, as Ryan Crocker said, the point of failure. Not the military campaign, but the post-military campaign.
Fair enough. Eric, I'm curious to get your opinion on whether you think life is better today for a majority of Afghans, in spite of all the problems, in spite of the endemic corruption that you both acknowledge, knowing that 30% of girls are now in school compared to the 0% under the Taliban, and that there is some sort of governmental infrastructure that has processes that are somewhat functional. Do you at least concede that life is better for a majority of Afghans today?
Not necessarily. The life may be better for the Afghans who live in Kabul, but who are pampered and spoiled and protected by the government and recipients of a great deal of American money. Outside of Kabul, life goes on as it always did. And what was so ironic, after the 2001 invasion, American TV was blaring the message that we were invading Afghanistan to liberate its oppressed women. And at the same time, they were showing Northern Alliance people with their women in burqas, head-to-foot burqas, being whipped by their loving husbands. And so it's a very limited benefit. Look, it's the same thing as in Vietnam. You had a pampered elite in Saigon while the rest of the country did not benefit.
Okay. I'd again like to move this forward and ask now, Mark, how much longer do you think the U.S. can stay in Afghanistan? Is there an end game in sight?
Well, those are two different questions. How long can the United States stay, and how long should the United States and its coalition allies stay? My fear, and I think Eric would agree with this, as soon as the foreign troops pull out of Afghanistan, the Taliban will retake the country. The fact is that the corruption and the poor governance has allowed the Taliban to find sanctuary and safe haven among the people inside of Afghanistan. Given the choice between a corrupt government and a very, very pure Taliban, many of the districts inside of Afghanistan are picking the Taliban. And that's probably what will happen if the international community pulls out of Afghanistan.
Okay. Eric, I'd like to get your final thoughts on this. And what do you think is left now to the next administration as far as policy on Afghanistan is concerned?
More stumbling around. Mark is 100% correct when he says that if the U.S. withdraws its troops, and particularly its air power, because it's American air power that keeps this government in power, and at titanic expense, too. We were maintaining 24/7 air combat patrols over Afghanistan. We're using B-52 heavy bombers and B-1 heavy bombers. While we're yelling about Aleppo and Russian air power, we're using heavy bombers in Afghanistan. Now, I see the Taliban is a tribal fighting force. I was with them in the field. They fight for a while, then they go home, and then they come back and fight a little while later. It's a part-time job. They can stay there forever. They can fight forever, and they're very determined people. They're very, very brave fighters, as we've seen. So the U.S. is stuck on the horns of a dilemma. If it pulls out, it'll be a defeat. It will be hailed around the world as a defeat of American imperialism, et cetera, et cetera. All the Islamists will ballyhoo the thing. And at the same time, there is no likely political solution because the U.S. has based its power on unpopular minorities rather than dealing honestly with the majority Pashtun population.
Okay. Eric, I'm going to have to give you the last word because unfortunately we're out of time. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.